This took place in either late January or early February 2015. I remember this because it was the same day I scraped the side of my new 2015 car. Anyways, I had just arrived at my driveway after picking up my son at my aunt's house after work. Typically, when I get him out of the car seat, we walk around my car from the front side by the passenger door and make our way inside the house. That day, however, for some reason, we walked behind the car. This meant in order to get to the front door, we would have to walk behind my sister's truck and cut over the lawn to walk up to the house. Right next to my sister's truck, we have 2 miniature fir trees. In between those 2 trees are rose bushes. As we walked around the bigger tree, I heard an incredibly loud fluttering sound. My first thought was that it was a loud hummingbird. I turned around to look at it, and it wasn't a bird. It was a fairy. I'm sure of it. It wasn't tiny like you would expect. It was probably about 8 inches tall, or maybe 9. It was extremely lean, almost skeletal. Her arms were nothing but bones, and her skin tone was a dark, wooden orange-brown, like tree bark. She wore a dress. It almost looked like a leaf, but I can't be sure that's what it was. It was green, but more like a green-brown color. I've seen leaves that color before. The dress was strapless and it fell below her knees. Her face wasn't pretty. Her wings I remember the most. They were quite large compared to her body. Again, I wouldn't have expected them to be so large. I would have imagined fairies to have small to medium wings, but these wings were very large and see-through. They were fluttering rapidly, which is where that loud sound came from. She saw me looking at her in disbelief, and she flew around the tree. It looked like she went inside it. And just like that, she was gone. It all lasted no more than 3 seconds, but I remember it vividly. When she disappeared, I was in shock for a moment and just stood there until I heard my son say, "Mommy, what was that?" He sounded excited rather than shocked. I ran over to the tree she disappeared into, and I couldn't find the fairy anywhere. There was nothing there but pine needles. I looked at my son and said, "It was a bird." I didn't want to say fairy because, well, I don't know why, but I just said bird. He then giggled and said, "Mom, that was not a bird. What was it?" I then told him the truth. It was a fairy. And he just said, "Fairy? Oh, a fairy." And he went inside like nothing happened. I wish I could have accepted what I'd seen as easily as my son did. But I'll never forget that day. I grew up in a small town in New Zealand. When I was younger, I would often stay at my great-grandmother's house on the weekend and spend the days walking around her thick green garden. She had many flowers and trees and one grand raspberry bush that I always loved. I was drawn to it and somehow felt that it possessed its own magic. Sometimes at night, we would sit in front of the open fire and she would tell me about fairies and how they lived in the thick green. Normally, she said, we can't see them because whenever we look at them, they freeze in place and get mistaken for some ordinary thing, like a branch or a tree or a stone. But if you wait long enough, if you're quiet and the fairies become comfortable with you, sometimes they'll show themselves and move about. Great-grandmother's house had many wind chimes and clay ornaments of frogs and ducks and gnomes. It had stained glass, too, and small colorful windmills. It was a fun place to visit. She also had a big black iron door stopper in the life-size shape of an extinct New Zealand beetle, about the size of a large shoe. I was very young at the time of the incident, and I only remember it because I believe this was one of the most exciting moments of my life up until then. I must have been only about 6 years old. We were out the back door one evening, just standing on the concrete path outlining the house next to the grass in the garden, when this gigantic black beetle sauntered past me. It was headed away from the house and towards the raspberry bush. I remember being really excited by this. Like, it was the most exciting thing I had ever seen. I bent down to touch the huge bug, but my grandmother stopped me and told me to leave it alone. "They must never be touched," she said. So I watched the giant beetle march under the raspberry bush and then disappear. It wasn't until years later, after my great-grandmother died and we were selling the house, that I remembered this incident and told my family about it. And though every one of them remembered the big iron beetle door stopper, no one knew where it was or when it had last been seen. I saw some sort of fairy creature when I was around 6 or 7 years old. This was in rural Kentucky, in a wooded area on the edge of my family's property. It was near dark, and I was following several family members towards our house, trailing behind as I often did. As I shuffled along, I happened to look up towards a big tree. There, high in the branches, sat a small creature with the face of an old man. It had a huge nose and a grouchy expression. If I had to guess, I would say the creature was maybe a foot tall, maybe less. His head was the biggest part of his body. He was just gazing around the forest with that grouchy look on his face. I had the impression that this was how his face was all the time. Grouchy, furrowed eyebrows and all. I was not surprised or shocked at what I saw. I only thought, wow, he looks unhappy. I then paid him no mind and continued to follow my family to the house. I'm not sure what type of fairy he was and have tried researching the creature, but haven't found anything. I will never forget that face, though. I've always believed in the fairy kingdom since then. My family and I stayed late at church on the night of the incident. I was about 9 or 10 at the time, and while the parents were all mingling and chatting amongst themselves, us kids were off chasing fireflies in the dark. The night was black and the trees were like big shadows. but for some reason I decided I wanted to be alone and wandered off by myself. I honestly have no idea why I did that, since I've never been a loner or anything like that. I didn't go far enough to get lost, but the voices of the others did become faint and distant. But I wasn't really paying attention. I'd found a lively little firefly buzzing near a tree. I approached it, delighted that this lovely, glowing creature could be my first catch. But then, just my luck, it darted out of sight. I was disappointed, but only for a second, because almost immediately I spotted another glowing form. This one was bright green, sort of neon, and floating gracefully, not buzzing around as the firefly had been. It was longer than the firefly, too. Not necessarily bigger, but definitely longer. I looked closer and realized the thing had dainty little arms and legs coming from its glowing luminescent form, with the tiniest, skinniest wings. It hovered in the air for a moment, as if it wanted me to see it. And I just stood there, sort of in a trance, before I heard my mom yelling my name. Then the fairy, because what else could it have been, flew away into the shadowy silhouettes of the trees. And that was it. I'm 16 now, and I still believe that at that church on that lovely night, I saw a real, actual fairy. I grew up in an old house in rural Ontario, almost entirely surrounded by trees. My dad was a carpenter and used to build all sorts of beautiful things, tables and chairs and clocks and picture frames. He even built a 3-story dollhouse filled with miniature furniture just for me. At 6 years old, that dollhouse was my prized possession. I used to play with it every day, shift around the furniture and the dolls inside so much, coming up with stories for them, that every night when I went to bed, that little house was a complete mess. But that year around Christmas, something strange started to happen. Every morning when I woke up, I would find that the dollhouse had been tidied. The furniture had been arranged neatly, and all the dolls were tucked away in their little beds. I didn't think anything of it at the time, just assuming that my mom had come in and tidied the house up for me. But then, on Christmas Eve, something happened that made me wonder if my mom had anything to do with the tidied dollhouse at all. I couldn't sleep, and was lying awake in bed listening excitedly for the sound of Santa's reindeer on the roof, when I saw something moving in my dollhouse. It was a little man, about 4 or 5 inches tall, dressed in a dark red suit that was really old-fashioned looking, like something out of a historical movie. He was sort of chubby and had rosy cheeks and a kindly expression. He walked through the bedroom of the dollhouse and then jumped down to the first floor. When I saw him jump, I gasped. And he looked up at me and let out a small sound like, "Oh," as if he'd made a mistake, as if he didn't want me to see him. And then he just vanished. The next day, I told my parents I had seen one of Santa's elves. They didn't believe me, of course, but at the time they humored me. And I forgot all about it pretty quickly with all the fun of Christmas morning. It wasn't until months later when my mom told me to clean up my dollhouse that I realized it wasn't just being magically tidied up anymore. I was thinking about the incident recently. I'm now 27, and asked my mom if she ever came into my room when I was a kid and tidied up my dollhouse when I was asleep. And she said she never did. I don't know what to make of it, but the memory is very vivid and feels real. It's a nice memory, though. I never felt afraid or threatened when I saw the little man, only surprised. I think, in a way, he might have been taking care of me. But my seeing him was against his rules or something, so he had to go away. In late January 2015, I was out for a walk in the woods on a snowy winter evening. It wasn't too cold and a gentle snow was falling, and there was a blanket of shimmery white on the ground and on the trees. It was really magical, and I was enjoying the scenery and the silence. The sun was starting to set, and the wood started to take on a purplish hue, and everything seemed twice as magical as it had before. The air itself seemed to be almost misty and sparkling. It's when I noticed a strange formation of snow piled up in the branches of a huge oak tree. The way the snow was formed made it look like a small person, maybe a young child, was squatting on the branch facing away from me while covered in snow. I didn't think twice about it because there was a lot of snow and it could easily fall into strange piles on the trees. But then, as I neared the tree, the snow formation moved, and I realized there was something alive under the snow. And then suddenly, it turned and looked right at me. It was an elf. There's no other way to describe it. It was mostly covered in snow, but I could see big dark eyes, pointed ears, and a long crooked nose. Its skin was sort of blue tinted, as if it was frozen, and it seemed to be dressed in blue as well, as far as I could tell, and was wearing a pointed hat. We stared at each other for a split second, and then both the elf man and all the snow he was covered in dropped from the branch onto the snowbank below. I couldn't believe what I had just seen and walked closer to the snowbank to see if there was anything there. But all I found was snow. Thanks for watching, and thanks so much to the subscribers who sent in their stories for this one. These fairy encounters weren't as scary as normal, but each one had a magical quality I thought was perfect for this season. Please do keep sending me your stories, whether scary or not, because I love reading them. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're new. In the meantime, I just want to wish all of you a wonderful, magical Christmas, Hanukkah, holiday, Saturnalia, whatever you happen to celebrate. And I've got a lot more scary fairy encounter stories and scary fairy stories in general coming up in the new year, so please come and visit me. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.